So let me begin by just some overall comments, and then I'll comment on a few particulars that I think reinforce the overall comments that I'll make. And first, a little history for you, and as I look over the audience that's come today, most of you are old enough to remember this. So going back to the 80s, when Ronald Reagan was our president, it was the end of the Cold War. Gorbachev was in power in the Soviet Union. And Reagan and Gorbachev began talking about arms control. And Ronald Reagan had a line that he would use. It was a Russian line. He knew the Russian words. How well he pronounced them, I don't know, but he knew the words. And he on one occasion in particular, in front of the live television cameras that were filming this, Ronald Reagan said, "Trust but verify." He said it first in Russian, and then it was translated. Trust but verified. And he looked at Gorbachev for Gorbachev's agreement. And as I remember it, at least, I didn't go back and check the video, Gorbachev sort of rolled his eyes and said, "You love to say that." And it got a good laugh from that audience. Trust but verify. And if you remember the end of the Cold War, you know what Reagan meant by that. Yes, we're trying to trust each other about bringing this Cold War, especially with nuclear weapons, down. But we don't trust each other quite well enough that we can't insist on some sort of verification. Trust, but verify. Synod this year reminds me of that phrase. We trust each other. That was sort of the theme of Synod. We're coming together in trust. We have to be able to trust one another. And yet, at the same time, there was a whole lot of, yeah, but we better verify. We better make sure that we're doing the right things the right way. Trust but verify. It was a Synod of trust. Now, I grant you that part of that trust was present because some have left the denomination, right? So it was a little easier to trust in that room by the delegates, I think, because some weren't there. I think that's very sad, but it also provided some opportunity to be on the same page. Synod wasn't a particularly contentious Synod this year. In fact, it was less contentious than I think it's been for years. But there was this undercurrent of, we need to make sure, like I said last year in my report, that we batten down the hatches, that we dot all our I's and cross all our T's and are perfectly clear that all of us who are now together are orthodox and on the same page on any number of things. And I thought that spirit ran throughout Synod. So what you thought about Synod and what my friends and my colleagues thought about Synod depends a little bit on your perspective. I heard plenty of people who said, oh yeah, Synod is still, trying to put the hammer down and make sure everyone stays in line. And I heard other people, many of them, say, I thought there was a better spirit at Synod. And I find myself sort of torn between those two things. I do think there was a better spirit at Synod. But there was also this continued lingering of making sure everyone toes the line and that no one's out of step. And what you make of that depends a little bit on your perspective. So, for example, there was one leader in leadership at Synod who after Synod was sort of saying, we came close, but we didn't get it quite. We didn't get it quite. And he was suggesting that things should have been a little tighter. And then there was another who thought Synod once again was awful. And these are both colleagues of mine. They both presumably were at the same Synod or at least saw the same Synod. And so in that sense, Synod still reflects the times we live in. That's kind of the way we are as a society as well. So what was on the docket at Synod? No great big burning issues like some of the past years. We weren't re-adjudicating human sexuality or the human sexuality report. It was more around the edges of how's that going to be enforced and what will that mean for the denomination. So let me just mention a few of the specifics, and then if you have any specific questions, I'll give you time for that. One of the things that was still on the agenda was the covenant of office bearers. And what does that mean? The covenant of office bearers is the promise that office bearers sign to hold to the teachings of the church and to faithfully reflect those teachings of the church. The reason it has been contentious, no one ever used to talk about the covenant of office bearers, or before that the form of subscription. Everyone just signed it and didn't, at least my impression is, didn't think all that much about it. Of course, we're all on the same team. But it's been contentious precisely because of human sexuality. And human sexuality has been declared a confessional interpretation, meaning you need to, if you're going to be an office bearer, a pastor, elder, or deacon, you need to agree with this. And how you put the wording of that covenant has been, there's been a lot of discussion about it. There has been a lot of discussion about the word in that covenant, like you can't have any difficulty with the teachings. Well, what does difficulty mean? Another word that has been used is without reservation, that you affirm without reservation. Well, what does without reservation mean? Depending on what day it is, I have reservation just about everything that I think and believe. So what does it mean? And people were interpreting that different ways. So they in the covenant for office bearers and what it means to hold to something without reservation, they took out the word difficulty, because what I call a difficulty and what you call a difficulty might be different things. And they used the phrase that if you sign the covenant for office bearers, it means you agree with the teaching of the church and you do not have either a persistent, serious doubt or a settled conviction contrary to any of the confessional teachings of the church. Notice that language. And you can see how they're trying to make it clear. But of course, in the clarity, you might have questions. You cannot have persistent, serious doubt and be an office bearer. Persistent or serious doubt about one of the confessional teachings of the church. And you certainly can't have a settled conviction contrary to it. All right? That's how they're trying to parse the language. So you can be an office bearer if you sometimes wonder about LGBTQ issues and how do we love people if we're telling them they can't live in God's will if they're living out that lifestyle. What does that look like, and is that fair to people? You can have wondering, you can have questions. If you call that a doubt, you can have doubts, but you can't have a persistent, serious doubt or a settled conviction that this is just wrong, and I know it's wrong. Then you could not serve as an office bearer. This also relates to what you do as an office bearer if you have an objection. Synod this year again clarified, sort of doubling down and adding to the church order. There are only two ways as an office bearer to object. Either you make an official request called a gravamen that it get changed and ask your council that they should overture classis and then overture synod that it should be changed, or you have a confessional difficulty gravamen, which means you simply have questions or issues and you're looking for your local council to help you sort this out. What you cannot have is a settled conviction that the teaching is wrong and just stay in office all 3 years. The local council has to decide these matters. So that was one thing. If that all sounds a little bit familiar to those of you who have been paying attention to Synod, it is a little bit familiar. It's just a tweaking of the language to try to make that clear. There was also a question about baptism, and this is a little bit insider baseball. If you didn't notice that, you're to be excused, but some people noticed that Synod last year made a comment about baptism, that you couldn't baptize children of LGBTQ people because that would be an indication that you agreed with that lifestyle. And there was question, well, what does that mean? Doesn't the local council get to decide who they're going to baptize and who they're not? Is this Synod trying to tell a local council, which has original authority over things like this, who can be baptized? Wouldn't there be reasons a church council could say, out of concern for this child and love for this child, we're going to... And Synod this year reaffirmed that yes, indeed, that is up to the local council. The denomination doesn't tell you who you can baptize or not. That's up to your pastors and your elders in particular as they weigh such issues. So that was a clarification which some people found quite helpful. There were conversations about the banners mandate, and more than conversations, a change of the banners mandate. And I know because I was on the COD that long before human sexuality came up, this has been a long time discussion in the denomination. The banner is really a separate entity. It is not directly under the control of the executive director or the general secretary. The different titles have been used through the years. And in some sense, the banner isn't even under control of Synod. It is independent. It is the Christian Reformed Church official publication. It is paid for by ministry shares, at least for the time being, but it has editorial freedom to stir the pot. In fact, that was the original idea. The image was always used, it's like a family sitting around the kitchen table, and then your wild radical kid throws out some crazy idea and all the rest of you jump on him. That's a crazy idea, why would you say so? The banner was like a kitchen table, stirring the pot around issues so that we could talk to one another and have good conversations. As you can imagine, as some of these conversations got quite serious, as they have in the past, people would regularly complain about the banner. Why do we pay money to have an official publication that publicizes stuff that we disagree with? You could see the issue. It'd be a little bit like Brookside paying through its general fund budget for a couple of you to write in opposition of what the elders and the pastor have decided for the sake of good conversation. That's how some saw it and said, so we need to bring a banner mandate that says the banner needs to first represent the CRC and our convictions and belief and be consistent in that, and less of the stirring of the pot stuff. I'm using euphemisms to describe this. The editor of the banner was not amused by this change and resigned. As he himself put it, resigned in protest to that. Knowing him, I'm not surprised. He saw himself as someone who would try to stir the pot and keep good conversations going. Paul Vanderklay was a classmate of mine. He was the presenter on the floor on this issue, and he tried to make the case that, you know what, we're not people all sitting around a kitchen table anymore. The world isn't that small. He used the word, it's like we're in a cafeteria. The banner isn't just being read around a kitchen table of all fellow believers who all believe the same thing, and now we can just stir the pot because we're just talking to ourselves. No, the banner is like someone standing up in a big cafeteria and talking out loud and expressing their opinions. It causes confusion and uncertainty. Nor do we just get our information about the denomination from the banner like it used to be. We have online publications. The CRC itself produces publications. The college produces them. The seminary produces them. You can read. The world's a different place, and we need our official publication to be a promotion piece for the denomination, not something different. And as you can imagine, people have wildly divergent opinions as to how wise this was. Synod, at least, passed the change of mandate overwhelmingly. The vote wasn't even close. You've heard me say this same theme before. But it's a fairly significant change for the banner, and so that's something you might have heard about.
Can you explain that change a little bit more?
The banners.
Please repeat the question.
Yeah, can you explain that change? The banner's mandate used to have the words very specifically in it that the banner was to produce diverse opinions on various issues in order to promote thought. The diverse is the exact word. That word is now gone. The banner's job is not to produce and promote diverse thought. It's to produce and promote the Christian Reformed Church's perspective on matters. So that's the big change. A lot of people found it very ironic or sad, maybe sad's a better word, that up on the big screen, at Synod, if you've ever seen it or watched live, up on the big screen you see the motions, and then using a Word document, we use the strike-through feature to show what words are going to change in the mandate. The word diversity had a great big line through it. You could see how uncomfortable that made people, right? We're going to become less diverse, and that's the criticism of the mandate change. Those who would support it said, yeah, it's a bad visual. We should have probably thought about that. But all we mean to say is, hey, if we're going to be paying the money for this, we need to be promoting the CRC, not tearing it down. That's sort of the way the argument goes on that. There were also questions about our university and our seminary. And again, Jewel could give you chapter and verse on this, of course, because he's the president of the seminary. In both cases, the university's policies about professors and the seminarians' policies about professor were well received by Synod. Synod thanked them for their good work. Synod essentially said, you are well on your way, but we'd like a little more information about exactly what that would look like. Particularly to the seminary, the instruction was, help us understand how this applies not to tenured professor, but to other instructors who maybe don't have tenure. So I don't want to get into all of that because, again, it gets a little nebulous. But basically, both the seminary and the university are saying we support the denominationalist teaching. Our teaching from the university and the seminary will be in line with the teaching. When we have teachers who come from a different perspective, we will make sure that there is nothing being taught that is outside of the bounds. I'm putting it in layman's language and simplifying it, but that's the long and the short of it. There were some who thought the Synod might come down harder on the university and say, not good enough. That wasn't my read of what happened. My read was, this is good work, just a little more fine-tuning, and I think the same to the seminary. This is good work, just continue to fine-tune it and show us a little bit more. There were some there who wanted us to cut our ties with the RCA because the RCA allows differing opinions on LGBTQ plus issues. It probably didn't help any that a lot of our pastors who have left the denomination have aligned with the RCA. It's kind of like salt in the wound, so why are we so friendly with these people? I'm simplifying the argument. Synod said, we're going to have a 5-year discussion on that and look at that. We're not going to just cut off a sister denomination because we have some concerns. We're going to dialogue on that issue. There were conversations around the Belhar. I've been to lots of synods since the Belhar confession was not received as a full confession. And it comes up every 2 or 3 years, something around the edges. There were people who wanted the Belhar added to the covenant for office bearers in the same way that our world belongs to God as a contemporary testimony is. That was turned turned down. There's been some argumentation about covenant for office bearers. Does that need to be signed by every office bearer every year, every time they go to classis? What does that look like? And what Synod says is whenever classis meets, all the delegates should stand or in some ways give assent to the covenant. That's what happens at Synod as well. I realize I'm leaving some stuff out here. There were some who wanted, before anyone could serve on a board of the CRC, they needed to be vetted by seminary. There needed to be a special committee of Synod that would look at all the candidates and make sure their I's were dotted and T's were crossed, which would have been a pretty big change. Right now, we trust the boards to do that, and we only hold people accountable if there's a problem. Synod said, yeah, we're not going to do that. We don't think we need to second guess what our boards have done. We would like our boards to show us the, what's it called, Jewel? The rubrics that we use in determining whether a person is in alignment with our teaching. So everyone is supposed to come back with some rubrics. I could go on about some other things. Virtual churches. Can a virtual church be a real church? The denomination said, maybe. Sometimes, probably, but we're not entirely sure. Let's continue to give our churches some freedom. In other words, what if people in Costa Rica, I'll use that since my daughter is, what if Kayla and Cody got a whole slew of people around them in Costa Rica that said, we're going to spin off from Brookside and we're going to be our own church and we're just going to watch Brookside online. That's not a perfect example because they're still aligning with Brookside, but what if they were, could that be a real church? There's some of a generation gap there that was present at Synod. Almost everyone who spoke in favor of a virtual church being a real church was on the younger end. Those who were most concerned were on the older end. Synod said, we don't think it's very likely that a church that is completely virtual could be a real communion of the saints, a real body. But we don't want to say an absolute no either, because we're still learning about all this, most of us. Lots more I could say about specific things, but again, do you see how the trust but verify works? Trying to come together and trust each other, and yet a whole lot of conversation around what does that look like and what does that mean for the future. I hope that summary is somewhat helpful and not just further confusing to you, but I imagine there might be some questions about things. Before I open up the floor for questions, the banner is a great resource. They have an online presence. They have a Facebook page. You can see every article they wrote about Synod on many of the issues I referred to and many of the other issues I didn't refer to. Our General Secretary, Zach King, in the next couple of weeks probably, will come out with what I would call an executive summary, and that will be available on the CRCNA website, the General Secretary's summary of the decisions of Synod. I think Zach King is a very trustworthy person. I think he will say what that means, and I'd point you in that direction as well. And then otherwise, talk to people you trust who were at Synod or have a part of Synod, and they can give you good advice about what the decisions actually meant. One thing not to do: don't just listen to people who you know are going to tell you what you already believe and already think. There's a lot of that on social media, as I hope you know. In other words, if you hang around with conservatives all the time, they're probably going to tell you Synod was pretty good, but we could have been a little tighter on things. If you hang around with a lot of people who have already left the denomination or are thinking of leaving the denomination, they will point to Synod as yet another stepping stone in why they're leaving. That's been my experience. So try to listen to both to get perhaps a fair perspective on what went on. That's a lot of words for me, maybe even too many, but I wonder if you have any questions. Yeah, way in back. Go ahead, Laura.
Is Zach King going to be the new editor, or have they chosen a new editor now that...
Zach King, who's the General Secretary, definitely will not be the new editor. The question was, would Zach King become the new editor? No. The banner will remain a separate publication. CRC Communications is its own thing. Zach King's involved in that, as well as our Director of Communications. The banner will continue to have some independence. It's just its mandate that changed. I really don't know where they've, how they'll look for an editor or what that process will be, but it will be a separate editor.
Does Synod appoint an editor for the banner?
Synod, at the very least, concurs with the appointments. I'm not sure exactly how that language goes, but yes, Synod has to approve the editor of the banner. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Were there also reports about the denominational ministries, like home mission, world mission is what it used to be, and how are they doing now with all of this?
Thank you, Abe. That's a good question. I made the cardinal mistake that so many of us make when we think about Synod. We think about all the stuff and we sometimes forget all the vital ministries of the denomination, like Resonate, Global Mission, and the other agencies. Yes, they all report at Synod. It's not just the university and the seminary, but Resonate reports, and they represent both home missions and world missions, what those of us who are older would think of as those two things. Good work continues to be done. There is a significant money crunch that these agencies, almost all of them, are experiencing. Some of that would be anticipated given that we have churches and others who are leaving. And so there's a lot of realignment happening. Even one of the missionaries that we support here at Brookside, the Russian broadcast ministry of World Renew, has been laid off. There's been a ceasing of money from the denomination for church planting, that is direct grants. So the fiscal crunch is real, but good ministries continue to go on, and ministries are trying to figure out how to realign themselves for the future moving forward. Thanks for the question, Abe.
Now, ministries, the minister's pension fund,
Yes.
the ministers that left are with the RCA. What happens to that?
Yeah, this is a question about the minister's pension fund. The minister's pension fund is a vested fund. I always get myself in trouble when I use financial terms, but what I think that means, what I know that means, is that you pay money in and it's completely independent of whether you leave the denomination or not. Your years of service remain. If you leave if I decided to be Lutheran tomorrow and left the denomination, my pension would still have all my years of service in it, and I would still be eligible according to my number of years of service in the mathematical formula. In fact, that's even true for a minister who gets kicked out for some sort of ethical reason. A vested pension, that's there. There's no way for the denomination to say, we're not going to pay you because we don't like you anymore, or because you've done something wrong. It's a vested pension. Thank you for the question.
Churches that have left, have they all joined the RCA, or how have they changed their names?
Great question, Marilyn. Most of the churches that have disaffiliated have not reaffiliated with anyone. They're still in process at the time. Their pastors have to do something with their credentials. To be a reverend, you have to belong somewhere. And most of them, many of them, especially in this area, have aligned with the RCA. So the pastors themselves have their credentials held by a Reformed classis. And in the Reformed Church of America, by the way, a classis holds credentials, not a local church. So it's relatively easy for the pastor of a local church to say, this is where my credentials are, this classis, while they're still serving another congregation. The churches are taking their time, this is what their pastors tell me, to figure out exactly where they think they fit. Or to use a common expression, they don't want to jump out of the frying pan into the fire. They want to take their time thinking, because the RCA itself has its issues, right? So most of those churches right now they're not CRC, they're not RCA, they're just trying to figure out what they're going to do going forward.
So have they changed their names?
They will be changing their names. Some, I think, have already changed their names, but it's difficult. You got articles of incorporation you got to change, you got the front sign you got to change your name on the bulletin, and the easiest to change is on the bulletin and maybe your front sign, but legally this all takes a little while to untangle. But yes, all of them will be dropping Christian Reform. Legally, they'll need to. And I think most of them probably want to anyway, so. Some of them don't have to because it's not in their name, right? As is common these days, churches don't use their denominational affiliation in their name.
Do you have an idea, do you have an idea how many churches this is about that are leaving?
I do not know that. I was at classes. How many churches are leaving? The vast majority of them are in the Grand Rapids area. So if you live right here, you would think, more than half of Classis East left, for example. No one left Classis Thornapple, and most of the other surrounding classes, Granville, Grand Rapids South, and Grand Rapids North, I'm not sure if any churches have officially left, maybe one or two. So most of them are from Grand Rapids East, and I think from them, if I remember right, there were 8. Do you know offhand, Jewel, the number?
The whole denomination?
Yeah.
Because they have to be voted on at a classis meeting, but it looks to be around the 30 number.
Okay, about a total of 30 throughout the whole denomination, and we have roughly 900 churches.
And we're not done with the whole process.
And of course, there will be more that will be leaving. Right in the Grand Rapids area, there's like a dozen churches.
Is there any talk of between the Canadian churches and the U.S. churches of splitting?
Thank you. There is always talk between the American churches and the Canadian churches about how do we minister together and splitting. And as you won't be surprised to hear, human sexuality has stirred that pot all over again. In fact, there was a recommendation, not a recommendation, an overture coming to Synod saying, the Canadian churches ought to just split off. Let's forget about the American problems. We have enough Canadian problems. Let's just, but that was overwhelmingly turned down. That went nowhere. So we remain a binational denomination, even an international denomination, because we're beginning to get more Latino churches in as well. That nothing changed organizationally at Synod, but the question was asked. Yeah.
Paul, you talked about the financial squeeze that is obvious in existing ministries. Were there projections made for the future of such institutions as the Calvin University or the Calvin Seminary?
The university and the seminary, the question is about funding, right? The financial squeeze. Were there projections made about the future? There were some projections made. And like most financial projections, it all depends on what you feed into the equation to get the result. The university and the seminary are really quite healthy, especially the university, because they don't depend that much on direct money from the denomination through ministry shares. Seminary depends on a little bit more, but both of them have wide network of givers outside of the CRC. And the big question in the room that's a little hard to navigate is for like Resonate, for the university, for the seminary, for Thrive Ministries, which is the congregational ministries, the umbrella group. We believe, at least optimistically, that even some of the churches that have left the denomination may continue to contribute to these in some way, shape, or form. In other words, if I've taken my church out of the denomination, but I have a missionary that I have a long history with who I'm likely to continue to support that missionary financially. I might even give the money through Resonate. I suppose if I'm particularly annoyed or don't trust in some way, I might want to shift the money directly to the missionary. But I'm likely to continue to support the missionary, don't you think? But all of that has to play out, John, right? So it's a little hard. It's a little hard to project how that will work. Yes.
Was there any talk at classes about, at Synod, about classes Red Mesa pulling out?
Was there any talk at classes about, or a Synod about Classis Red Mesa pulling out? For those of you who don't know, Classis Red Mesa is a unique classis. It's out west, made up primarily of indigenous congregations. They have some unique rules because of their unique situation. There was no talk about them pulling out that I heard. That doesn't mean there wasn't, because again, remember, I wasn't an eyewitness. I wasn't there for that. Because of their uniqueness, there's often conversation around, are we better with the denomination or without the denomination? Much of that hasn't centered around human sexuality, but there's all sorts of things it centers around. I didn't hear any, if there was, Lois.
I don't know if this was even an issue at Synod, but was there any conversation about the shortage of pastors in the denomination?
There was. There's conversation about shortage of pastors in the denomination. And there were a number of things done at Synod to try to increase that. For example, classes were asked to think about licensing people to exhort, giving them licensure to preach would be the simple language, on a more regular basis. Susan LeClaire talked at length about how we can give training to pastors who don't come through the regular routes, and trying to codify that a little more simply to make clear, especially pastors of solo congregations. If they haven't come through the regular channels, that is a seminary degree like I did, 4 years of college, 4 years of seminary with an internship, how can we make sure they're qualified for that by being well trained? And so we're trying to clarify what that would look like while encouraging people. Not everyone is going to be, the 18-year-old kid who goes to college and then right after college goes to seminary and then gets in their first church when they're 25. In fact, that's quite unusual these days. A lot of people are second career students, so they're coming in all different paths. I think, at least from what I heard at Synod, Synod is trying to do a good job of not putting roadblocks in the way of people who have been called and gifted. while at the same time trying to make sure they get adequate training to do what they need to do. I hope that helps with that question. Ralph was asking about pastors and are there enough in the denomination and what are we doing about that?
Have there been any discussions about how Synod can give concrete recommendations to the congregations about how to maintain our stand on the LGBTQ and yet incorporate and love, concrete things about
Yes. Thank you for the question. The question is, has Synod done any talk or the denomination about how we can maintain our current stance on LGBTQ, but then how do we love and care for those who are experiencing those relationships? What does that even look like? How can we do a better job? I think the simplest answer to that question is there have been some, but in my opinion, it's been quite limited. We've been mostly fighting amongst ourselves as to what our position is going to be and not enough thought to how do we love and care for people who fall outside of that position and how do we demonstrate that. That's my personal opinion. There have been better resources outside of the denomination, often people in the denomination involved. For example, David Beelan, you hear me talk about David Beelan, retired CRC pastor from Madison. He works with an organization called Cora Diem, and I was just in a seminar class, a cohort, which deals specifically with that issue. Okay, if we take the historic Christian biblical stance on LGBTQ issues, how do we care for and enfold people who come to us and need care? That was exactly what that cohort was about. I think those sort of things are helpful. I think Zach King has begun to try to address some of those. But again, my own impression, I think we've been so busy putting out our own internal fires that we haven't thought nearly enough about that. And that's a great sadness of mine.
Because they're so good at it, you think that at least make a committee to study the issue.
We are good at making committees, you are right. There could at least be a committee to study that issue. But again, I'm just telling you my own reflection. Right now, the level we're talking more about trust than we're living it out. That level is still fairly low, and it takes a high trust level to talk about these difficult issues. If you're always looking at me, waiting for me to step out of bounds, and I'm always looking at you, waiting for you to step out of bounds, it's hard to do ministry, right? And so I think we need to continue to increase that trust in the denomination.
Seminary, are they supposed to follow the CRC guidelines?
The seminary does follow the CRC guidelines, and they're required to do that.
Okay, and forget about the churches that left. For the reason why they're leaving, they would not, how do I want to say it? Forget it, I don't know.
Well, I have a guess as to where you're maybe going, Nancy, and I bet Jewel could say. The question on the seminary is, yes, the seminary is the Christian Reformed Church's seminary, our preferred seminary, our only seminary. You can go to seminary elsewhere, but you still need to come through Calvin in some way, shape, or form. And that will remain. What about these disaffiliating churches? Could there be some cooperation between Synod and them, or a seminary and them? Well, there could be. Some of them might choose to still use the seminary, depending on what that relationship might be. The real issue that Synod was asking the seminary about was making sure that their instructors and their key staff people appropriately know the Christian Reformed Church's position, the creeds and confessions, and are teaching in accordance with that. We've always had people from outside of our tradition. For example, we have people that don't believe in election or infant baptism, and they'll come to Calvin Seminary because they see it as a good seminary. So I hope that helps a little bit with your question.
I have one major concern about ministering to homosexuals in the spirit that Nellie has reported way back when. I have big questions in regards to should we allow a man and a man to marry in the church, or a woman and a woman marry in the church and become a homosexual family sanctioned by the church. I have problems with that, and I hope that that will not happen in terms of doing ministry to homosexuals.
Right.
I think that there is a very good book out there that explains homosexual from a biblical point of view, and I want to refer to everybody else here about Butterfield, and I think I mentioned that book to you, and I'm certain that you have read it yourself too.
So Rob is pointing out what some of the conversation in the denomination has been through over the years. The denomination's official position is that marriage between a man and a man is not a legitimate ecclesiastical marriage in the church. Pastors are not supposed to officiate at that, and that's what much of the argumentation has been about and why some churches have left. So the question is, what do we do if, for example, a couple comes to church and they start worshiping at Brookside, and they're a family, they're married, 2 women, 2 men. And what if they adopt a child or have a child in vitro or some other means and present that child for baptism? What's clear is that the church can endorse the lifestyle, can endorse the marriage, but how do we minister to them then? And those are the questions that I think are very important pastorally to answer. I don't think anyone at this point in the CRC, at least not who's still remaining or planning to remain in leadership, is suggesting that we should change. That ship has sailed, that we should change our official position. There are people like myself who say we have to figure out better how we do minister to those individuals. If we can't sanction their marriage, how do we love them and care for them and walk alongside them? Those are some of the issues that are huge pastoral issues that the church has to continue to navigate.
On that issue of how we minister to people that are same-sex attracted, okay? The church decided that in 1973.
You're correct.
Okay, they decided that being same-sex attracted is not sinful, and you may be elder, pastor, deacon, or theological professor if you are celibate, same-sex attracted.
Correct.
Okay, so the only issue that's come up in the last few years is may same-sex attracted people ever make a lifetime commitment to each other called marriage?
Right.
We said no to that one.
Right.
But if you look at the people in the church, I think, I don't know any percentage, but a vast majority don't know that the official position of the church is that homosexuality itself is not sinful.
Right.
So how can the church minister to homosexual people when most of the people in the church think that they're sinful just to be homosexual? I think we can't, it's a question. We can't
Right.
minister to them if the people think this way.
So there are two realities in the Christian Reformed Church, more than two, but simplifying, there are two. To be homosexual, to use the initial LGBTQ plus for yourself, to have homosexual attraction, to use the language of the 1973 report, which was just being referred to, is not in and of itself sinful. There's no sin there. The sin comes when, to use the language of 1973, you practice that orientation or preference, as we used to call it. If you act on it, like by getting married, that is what the church says is wrong. And those two are easy to confuse. You see, there's two, right? Nothing wrong with being LGBTQ plus, being same-sex attracted. But if you act on that attraction, and certainly if you get married, that's where the sin is, and that's what the church can endorse. So then, how do we minister to these people? We've taken one thing off the table. How do we minister to them? That's what the church is continuing to navigate. And as far as I know, Synod didn't do much with that particular topic, at least not at this Synod, which, remember, is the focus of this conversation.
Now, you clarified that,
Yeah.
with the two things.
Yeah.
But if people in the church don't understand or even believe what Synod the 73 said, how can the
Yes.
church even expect to minister to them?
Yeah,
They
so-
come to the church and.
So one of the, thank you, Dan. One of the things that we're being reminded of is part of what was asked earlier. It helps for the church to be educated. Many people do not clearly understand the distinction. And I grant you, it's a distinction which the world rejects. That is part of our problem. The world says there's no way to be LGBTQ and not acting on it. In fact, it would be wrong. You're violating yourself. But the church's position is no, there's nothing wrong with being that way unless you're practicing and acting on that. That's the church's official position. And education on that would help. We don't just dismiss people because they're of the wrong initials, would be another way of putting it. Instead, we try to enfold them and show them what God's way might be for them. And that's something we haven't spent enough time examining. Any more questions about Synod?
Related to the human sexuality thing, but you talked about covenant office bearers. What are the requirements in that like for membership in the local church?
That's a great question. Norman said, I talked about covenant for office bearers. What is the requirement for membership? Well, for membership in a church, that's much more a local endeavor. If you become an officer or an officer in the church, a pastor, an elder, or a deacon, now you represent the church at other bodies, classis, and potentially synod. And so the denomination gets involved with who can go to classis and what they need to do. But in the local church, it's really the local church that determines the qualifications for membership and how they police that. There is no denominational rule that someone who disagrees with Synod, for example, on human sexuality, can't be a member of the church.
So they can't be an office bearer.
But in a Christian Reformed church, they could not be an office bearer, at least if the church is following the rules, right? And we still, we're a big denomination. I hope this isn't surprising to you. There are local congregations that turn a blind eye to rules. I suspect Brookside has done that more than once in its lifetime. But the denominational rules are you can't serve in office if you disagree.
Wouldn't that be an individual choice then if you sign the paper, then you're really lying or whatever?
If you're an office bearer, yes. That is precisely why the question was, when you sign the covenant for office bearer, you're saying you agree. Absolutely, you're saying you agree. And if you sign that and don't agree, you're not telling the truth. So again, what Synod reinforced is, let me make sure I get their new verbiage right, you cannot have a persistent, serious doubt, nor can you have a settled conviction contrary. That's the standard that you have to weigh for yourself, Harold, as to whether you can do that or not. Each person would to come in. That's what Synod has said. I want to thank you all for your time. If you have an individual question, I'll try to hang around for a little bit. Again, if you're really interested, there's an executive summary put out by Zach King, our General Secretary, that will probably come out in a couple of weeks. And you can always go back and look at the letters or the articles that the Banner has written. It's on Facebook and it's online at the Banner site.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.